Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 315, Torah Portions, Eating Biblically. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we begin our journey through another series of episodes that we are doing, this time on the subject of Jewish eating or Jewish food. This is a topic that a lot of people, including people in my family, have been asking us to do for a really long time. And we really wanted to do it. I don't know why we haven't done it already, but we're doing it now. So it's a big topic. There's a lot of ways that you could march through this category of Judaism and food. We could go through it historically and start from the very beginning and go in a row until we get to whatever happened last week. We could do it thematically. We could find other ways to do it. But we thought that just doing it straight through historically wouldn't necessarily be the best or most fun way to do it. So we apologize to those of you who are looking for the history to be all in one big chunk. It's going to be interspersed in this series along with other approaches, including contemporary thinking, ethics, all kinds of topics like that. And I hope that you will enjoy this more exploratory approach. I should note also that we are going to be taking breaks periodically in this series, as we have been all year, to explore various elements of the Shemitah year, the year of release that comes every 7 years. Of course, there are elements that are connected to food. The land obviously is connected to food in that the land produces things that we eat. And so there are obviously going to be connections between our Shemitah episodes and our food episodes, but you can also see them as something of a break. And we want you to see them as something of a break because the whole idea of Shemitah is that it's a break from our norms. But today we are beginning this journey through food, and we are beginning it at basically the earliest point. We are looking at what we can understand about the origins of Jewish eating as we see it reflected in the Bible. And I'm trying to say that in a careful way because I think a lot of people think about the Bible as the source for the early ways in which Jews might have eaten. In other words, the Bible is kind of a handbook where people see, well, we wrote down what is the right way to eat Jewishly, and Jewish eating after that always comes as an attempt to put the Bible into action in our eating, as opposed to seeing the Bible perhaps as a reflection of how people were eating long before the Bible. And that may or may not have carried forward into other times and into ultimately our time. Our guest today is Elaine Goodfriend. She teaches in the Department of Religious Studies and the Jewish Studies program at California State University, Northridge. And we originally discovered her work in a wonderful book, a collection of essays called Feasting and Fasting, The History and Ethics of Jewish Food, which came out a few years ago. And if you're interested in the subject of Judaism and food, it is a fantastic resource, highly recommended. And Elaine Goodfriend has the essay early on in that book called Food in the Biblical Era. Elaine Goodfriend has also written many articles and essays, including a number that you can find on thetorah.com. Some of them have to do with food, and one of them has to do with one of Lex's favorite topics, the number 7 in the Bible. We are really excited to have this conversation and to be launching this series. So, Elaine Goodfriend, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It is so great to have you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here.
Well, we're in this topic on Jewish food, and I think when your average American hears the topic of Jewish food, what immediately comes to mind, at least for those who are Ashkenazi, is things like brisket and matzo ball soup. But if we had been talking to somebody from the time of the Bible about, coming to sit down for a meal of Jewish food, and of course that's an anachronism, they didn't call themselves Jews, but conceptually, if we said, sit down for our people's food, what would they be expecting to be served at that meal?
Well, it wouldn't be the kind of matzah we eat today. It wouldn't be a crispy cracker. Rather, it would be a flatbread, something like a pita. Okay, pita bread would be a natural, perhaps different kinds of cereals. The pita bread or crackers would be dipped in flavored olive oil, perhaps olive oil mixed with spices. It might be dipped in salt. Other parts of the meal might be yogurt or various kinds of soft cheeses, but not hard cheeses. Occasionally, there would be meat to honor a guest. As we see, like, what do we know about what they ate in the Bible? We look at various stories. So we see that in, let's say, Genesis 18, that Abraham serves meat and milk together. Okay. So perhaps if you had a very honorable guest and you were wealthy, a moderately wealthy person, you might slaughter an animal and serve meat. But that might not have been the norm. Therefore, it was a rather simple meal: yogurt, various forms of grain. Definitely wine would be served. Okay, wine would definitely be part of the meal. It was probably imbibed once or twice a day. It was the main beverage of ancient Israel. Grape juice would go bad quickly and begin to ferment. So the norm would be to drink a lot of wine. An example of that is in the book of Lamentations, where it says something like, and children would look to their mother and say, where's our bread and where's our wine?
My daughter would be very jealous of those children.
Be coming from the mouth of a child asking for their daily wine. So therefore, we know that wine was really the major beverage of ancient Israel.
You know, there's that Woody Allen movie. I can't remember if it's Hannah and Her Sisters or Annie Hall, but he's trying to be like a non-Jew, and he goes out and he takes out of his bag like Wonder Bread and mayonnaise and things that are like stereotypically not Jewish meals. So I'm wondering, is there a version of that in the time of the Bible where what you just described is the meal that the Jews would sit down to and their neighbors would sit down to a different meal, or was it not really like that?
I don't think it was really like that. I think the idea was that Israelites would eat what Canaanites and Moabites and Ammonites and all the other people would eat, in terms of they were having a grain-based, milk-based, wine-based diet, but the major exception would be animals. So in other words, what animals would they eat? So therefore, other peoples, the assumption would be, ate what we'll call the impure animals, those that did not have a cleft foot and those that did not chew their cud. And therefore, we automatically think of the pig. But there were other animals as well, which were probably a common aspect of the daily diet among other people. And that would be, surprisingly enough, like the shafan and the arnevet, small furry animals. They had to be hunted, but they were probably eaten to a large extent as well. Because if you look at where the dietary laws are in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the shafan and arnevet even precede the pig. So maybe those were eaten more commonly. So therefore, perhaps Israelites didn't eat those little furry creatures, but the other peoples did, just like other peoples ate the pig. But the assumption is that Israelites did not.
I think we'll definitely come back to the question of whether Israelites were following the rules that the Bible talks about, because I know you have a great deal to say about that, and so do we. One thing I loved in the essay you wrote that we mentioned in our introduction from Feasting and Fasting is this is an essay about food in the biblical era, and it did not start by talking about permissible and impermissible animals. It didn't start by talking about, kashrut or keeping kosher.
Right.
And I wanted to name that it didn't start that way, because I think if you asked almost everybody, including, learned Jews and talk about food in the Bible, I think they would tend to start with questions of which animals are permitted to eat, which animals aren't permitted to eat. And only after that might they get to some other pieces. But I really want to dwell in what you just said about, you might find bread, you might find it dipped in oil, you'd find wine. That trifecta, that triad that you identified seems to be really important all over the Bible, but it's almost so important that it becomes unimportant. And what I mean by that, it's almost like the water we swim in. We forget that wine and bread and oil are even there because it's just so constant. And we also inhabit a society today, and even in other areas in history, where drinking wine, it doesn't feel like Jews are the only ones doing that. So if we were to think about what Jewish food is, we're probably not starting with wine. We're probably starting with those things like matzo ball soup or whatever that Dan mentioned. Mm-hmm. And by the way, putting aside whether that's the correct or incorrect way to start those conversations, tell us more. What is the meaning underneath these foods that are almost the water that the Bible is swimming in? Why is there so much wine? Why is there so much bread? Why is there so much oil, in addition to them just being sort of commonplace foods that folks were eating?
At this point, I think I'll go off on a slight tangent regarding the issue of wine versus beer. So you have these two terms in the Bible, yayin v'shechar. And yayin v'shechar, so yayin is wine, and shechar seems to be maybe synonymous with wine or refers to some kind of intoxicating beverage, because the root shachar or shechar or whatever refers to becoming intoxicated. Okay, so the idea would be, so if yayin, wine, is always paired with shechar, then what's shechar? And a lot of people these days want to say that shechar is beer. Did they drink beer in ancient Israel? And I would say, interesting about that is that's one of my most popular articles. So that's been like downloaded from the Torah.com more than any other article I had, is this interest in wine and beer. So I came to the conclusion that they did not drink beer in ancient Israel. Now, why do I say that in ancient Israel they didn't drink beer? Because in Mesopotamia and Egypt, they had a lot of water. They were river civilizations. There was no shortage of water. But in Israel, there was a serious shortage of water. So the Jordan provided virtually nothing. Ancient Israel was dependent upon rainfall. Because of the shortage of water, in other words, they couldn't add copious amounts of water to concentrated amounts of beverage like they did in Mesopotamia and Egypt. They were dependent upon the grapes, squeezing the grapes and utilizing the juice that came from the grapes. And therefore, wine was the beverage for a place where you didn't have large amounts of water. Similar to, I'll make a comparison between Israel and ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, they didn't drink beer. They drank wine. They also were, in a sense, a civilization that didn't have much water. They were dependent upon rainfall. So, I spent 3 months in India. And in India, when you watch poor people in India, most people, in a sense, are poor. You begin to realize that the staple of the diet is chapatis. Chapati is in various forms of flatbreads. And, when you go into an Indian restaurant, that's what you're often met with on the table. And those are utilized in order to eat the other dishes, whether it be meat or vegetables. But poor people in India, the staple of their diet are chapatis. And in a way, you can compare that to ancient Israel, where the staple of a person's diet would have been various flatbreads, pitas dipped in spiced oil. And you see this in the book of Ruth. See this in the book. During her break, she takes her chapati and dips it in the vinegar. And that's why you could say, what influence does that have on later Judaism? Is that explains why we say motzi on bread. And that, in other words, that it's the bread for later Judaism, it's bread that creates the meal. And therefore we say motzi, thank you, God, who brings bread from the ground. Okay, in other words, that it's bread that defines a meal for later Judaism. Challah, think of challah on Shabbat. And therefore, and I think this is an outgrowth of this idea of the primacy, just how important grain was for ancient Israel.
And for example, if you were picturing the temple, and some know that there was this thing called the showbread, which was put out on a table in front of the temple. I think that people in their minds, I think if people think about it, they don't really think this, but most people don't really think about it. And they're imagining that there was like a braided challah there,
right,
or some large loaf of bread. But really what it would have been was like a few pitas, right?
Right. Yeah, just a few flat pitas, nothing too impressive. When you were saying that, I was imagining it in my mind, and I saw braided challahs.
Right.
Completely anachronistic. Right.
And so olives is a similar situation, right? Because olives also is a way of kind of capturing water from the rain. And so to the extent that you get a liquid from it, olive oil, it's kind of a similar idea.
Right. And oil is nutritious. The importance of oil in their diet just reflects the paucity of their diet in other ways, that it would be bread dipped in oil would be their major source of calories. Oil is dense, in a sense, a dense food in terms of its calories. And we have to appreciate that our ancient ancestors were probably on the verge of malnutrition most of the time.
Right. So that's where I wanted to go a little bit. And I think we can also take this into the temple, but even just thinking about the life of a Israelite at that time, because I think that people, again, in their minds, they have a notion that these were shepherds. And so they had lots of animals all around. So they were like eating meat all the time and right. And just take one out of the flock. And that really, like you're saying, was not true for a few reasons, right? One is that they didn't actually have that many animals, that they were, like you say, on the verge of malnutrition. The other is that with a very limited number of exceptions, most of the animals that you would have in your flock would be useful to you. Like sheep would give you wool, and if you even had some kind of ox, they would be pulling your plow. So you wouldn't want to be killing those animals just to eat them.
This is an interesting subject because this is where I differ with, for instance, my teacher, Jacob Milgram. So scholars will say that ancient Israelites did not slaughter their animals to any large degree because animals were their wealth, and they didn't want to deplete their wealth by, in a sense, slaughtering one a week or something like that. On the other hand, there's another problem, and the problem is male animals. So, for instance, if we take a male goat, I've heard it from a goat farmer. I was going to say male goat farmer. No, that's okay. A goat farmer, that the males smell awful. They're wild. They're unruly. They don't give milk. As a result, they're of no good purpose. And therefore, we do find the slaughter of animals in ancient Israel. And I think bones prove that. In other words, the archaeologists who find bones, and then they analyze the age of the animals that were slaughtered, and they find that many animals are slaughtered at a young age, and these were the males, because they were not very useful for, you couldn't breed with them, and they were unruly, and they were of no good purpose. So therefore, you could say, I raise the issue, maybe they ate meat more than we thought they did, just on the basis of the idea that males were expendable. So you could take a male and sacrifice it. So most animal sacrifices in the Torah are male animals.
I want to sit with the question of sacrifices a bit more on a few fronts. One is, so we've been talking a little bit about economics and who might be able to afford different kinds of foods and what was more common, what was less common. Some of my favorite parts of the Bible are like these very weird nitty-gritty parts. But so in Leviticus, there's a number of spots, and it might not even be just Leviticus. You might know, you probably know better than me. There's a number of spots where we talk about certain sacrifices, and it says, you should bring X animal. But if you can't afford that animal, bring these, like turtle doves is the next stage. And then,
right.
Oh, by the way, also, if you can't afford that, bring this like meal offering, like something really...
A handful of grain.
Right. And so I've given many Divrei Torah, many like little sermons about that, because I actually find it to be a deeply beautiful idea that we would build into a sacred text the notion that basically there's a progressive tax, like certain people
right.
that have more resources are asked to bring more, and certain people who can't afford that are able to give less. And all of it is sort of equally acceptable to God, who's like receiving the sacrifices. But I'd love to hear, to some extent, like what's happening underneath those sacrifices? Like what is being communicated between people doing sacrifices and, I guess, like God receiving the sacrifices? Like what did they conceptualize themselves as doing when they would bring these sacrifices? And to the extent this is relevant, like were people actually doing them? Like do we know the extent to which folks actually were bringing these sacrifices to this particular temple in Jerusalem? Talk to us about sacrifices a little bit.
The first thing that I want to say is that we live in a Christian society where the basis of our relationship with God is prayer. But if we lived in different societies and among people of other religions, we would realize that, in other words, Christianity is all about faith and prayer. If we were in India or the Middle East, we would realize that the basis of religious practice is sacrifice, giving, doing, as opposed to just faith and prayer. Sacrifice and bringing animals and all that stuff seems really weird when we read the Torah, but that's because we're living in a Christian society where all of that kinds of things that you do and bring has been replaced by prayer and faith. So if we lived in India and the major idea of visiting Kali, the Kali God temple, was to see the God and for the God to see you. In other words, this kind of building an intimate relationship with the God by visiting the God's holy place and also bringing a goat for slaughter. And this was, in a sense, a religious exhilaration for the people, in Calcutta, visiting this temple. But once I think I took a week or 4 or 5 days, and I sat and read the entire Torah through. And what's amazing is the degree to which the Torah does emphasize priestly issues, sacrifices and cultic calendars and offerings. And of course, the building of the tabernacle takes up 10 chapters. So yes, so the Torah is very much focused on, we can call issues of sacrifice, priestly issues, which for us as modern seems strange.
If I was thinking about this from the perspective of a priest, I would say, okay, here's a way that we're going to get pretty well fed without having to own any land. Okay, number one, we're going to say to people that you can't castrate your animals, so now they're going to have to eat them more often. Number two, we're going to tell them that you're not allowed to slaughter your animals to eat them unless you do it at a temple or one of our slaughter sites which we're the butcher here. You have to do it in our butcher shop. Number three, there's going to be a percentage of that slaughtered animal that you're going to have to give to us, and that's kind of how you pay the butcher to slaughter your meat. I mean, it's not terribly it's not like a scandal, but I think it's interesting to think about it in the way that we might think about the ancient priests are like today's butchers. Would be that you would bring
like a business model is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a business model. Like you would bring your animal to them. When we're thinking about food here in this series of episodes, it's making me kind of realize that it's actually worth looking at food from the perspective of two different populations. There's the regular people who every once in a while they'll have a little bit of meat. Probably not every day. It's every once in a while. It's more than nothing, like you were saying, but it's every once in a while. Whereas there's the priests that are running the whole operation, and they're getting meat every day because somebody's coming every day to slaughter. So they're eating this incredibly meat-rich, intense food, and the regular people are eating very differently. And I wonder, how that reverberates into the rest of Jewish history. You don't have to answer that part, but I'm curious about your describing, is that picture accurate?
You could say the focus of the Torah is supporting this priestly economy. In other words, the temple and the tithes and the firstborn animals and also the royalty. So when we look at what Solomon eats at his table, so it'll talk about hundreds and even thousands of animals slaughtered for the royal table. Of course, that might be exaggeration, but in any event, it's as if the Bible is proud of this. Look, on one hand, you have in Leviticus and Numbers the whole idea of all of these animals being donated to the priest. In other words, we assume that offers a historical picture, but of course, we can't really be sure of that. So what do we know? We only know from archaeology. We know a little bit from scholars who go and analyze the bones. So from that, so this is an interesting scholarly controversy, is the issue of not finding pig bones in Israelite sites. So if we go to the west and we go along the Philistine coast, there we find pig bones. But in the area identified as the sort of the central hill country where the Israelite tribes live, so we find a real paucity, very 1-2% pig bones in their garbage dumps. And the question is, in a sense, why? This would suggest then the paucity of pig bones suggests that they did follow the laws of the Torah in that way. So then scholars will quibble over, because the laws of the Torah, according to some, come after the Israelite period. So maybe the laws don't have anything to do with the lack of pig bones. Maybe the issue there is that somehow the climate of Israel wasn't conducive to growing pigs. So in other words, they're trying to get around the idea that Israelites actually followed the laws and suggesting that maybe it's something ecological. So today I'm wearing my little pig necklace.
Yes.
So I have a little silver pig necklace. And I bought it I was doing jury duty in Burbank, and I was wandering around the streets, and I came into the silver store, and I said, oh my God, a silver pig. I have to have that, because at that point I was writing in my article about pigs. And I just want to say that the whole idea that ancient Israelites didn't eat pigs is, or judging from the bones, and we have the prohibition, that's so exceptional and so unpragmatic. If you would say that, well, biblical laws were somehow, based on the ecology of ancient Israel and very pragmatic, that's absolutely not true, because the pig, keep in mind that the pig was a omnivorous scavenger. It ate everything, including feces. So I read these articles on the rearing of pigs in Asia, and it talks about how the pigsty was often under the village latrine. It shows us that pigs can take feces filled with like viruses and bacteria and turn it into edible meat. I mean, think of how, these days we talk about sustainability. Like, there's nothing better than the pig. So I'm just saying, so the whole idea that the dietary laws forbid pig, it would seem on the basis of archaeology that the ancient Israelites did observe the prohibition of pig, and how unpragmatic that notion really is.
This is a perfect segue into the question of what I'm going to start by calling kashrut.
Right.
Now, I'm only going to start by calling it kashrut because one of my favorite pieces of your essay is the very fact that you say there's nothing called kashrut. There's no system. There's no idea in the Bible of a systematic notion of eating. There is later a systematic notion of eating that is called kashrut in Jewish law that rabbis create, and that evolves over time. And we'll be talking with many folks in this unit about that. But what are the stakes of that question of whether kashrut is sort of systematic in the Bible? Why does it matter whether or not these are an assorted set of eating rules, or if there's actually a system? And then what might be some of the reasons for why the forbidden foods are forbidden?
Okay, I'm just trying to think if the Bible is systematic regarding anything, right? In other words, the Bible, there's certainly no systematic theology going on here, but especially the Torah, but the Bible in general. So you have so many different voices speaking and so many different opinions and so many different agendas that I think it's hard to build one concept of a systematic theory of kashrut there. What the Bible has in terms of system, you could say, is just the idea of eating meat. So the whole idea of the separation of milk and meat is clearly not a system yet. It only says you shall not boil a goat in its mother's milk. And therefore, while later on, of course, you have this whole idea of, you've heard the joke where God says to Moses, you shall not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. And Moses says, oh, I learned from that separate pots. To which God said, I said, you shall not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. So Moses says, you mean separate dishes, separate kitchens even. To which God said, you shall not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. To which Moses said, I got it now, separate restaurants. To which God said, okay, have it your way. See, so it just shows that, Jews obsess over all of these things, but the Bible just says don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. And it's not clear whether it's a rule for festival occasions or if it's even a dietary principle. So in a sense, we seem to see an evolution of that idea in the Torah, because the first time we see the prohibition of boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk, it's in Exodus 23 and Exodus 34, and it's in the context of pilgrimage festivals. When you come to the holy place, you shall not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, or something like that. Okay. And then it appears later on in Deuteronomy 14, which is a list of dietary principles. It's the prohibition of animals. And therefore, perhaps even within the Bible, there's an evolution of what that prohibition means. So now I'll talk about perhaps the idea behind the different prohibitions of animals. And I summarize that as, let's see. Well, the first is some people believe that the issue is health. Bible prohibits animals that don't chew their cud and animals that don't have a split hoof because it's an issue of health and bacteria. And they'll say that the pig has trichinosis, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, we don't know whether in ancient times pigs had trichinosis, but in any event, the Bible does not address the issue of health. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be a reason for the dietary laws. Just as regarding circumcision, some people would say, well, maybe circumcision is for health purposes, but of course the Bible doesn't address that at all. And in fact, if you look at the plain sense of the first place where circumcision is brought up in Genesis 17, it would seem that circumcision really is aimed at fertility. So back to dietary laws. So we have the idea that dietary laws are linked with health, and that is not indicated anywhere in the Torah. Another one is that it's a chok. Now, what's a chok? A chok is, we'll use the definition statute, but in the context of Jewish law, a chok is a law which has no rational meaning. Where do we get this from? Leviticus 19, where it says, and here are your choks, chukim. And the first one is, you shall not wear a garment of linen and wool, which seems to have no rational explanation. So kashrut then is seen as a chok. That is, it's not based on any rational purpose. Rather, it's the decree of the king. The king is testing your obedience, and therefore you follow, and there is no real reason for it. Okay, just discipline to follow God's will. The next concept is perhaps the idea, and we go to the ancient Greek philosopher Philo for this, is that you are what you eat. So the reason that one will eat a sheep, a goat, ruminating animals is that we learn how to ruminate. We follow their practices, and therefore when we have a philosophical concept, an idea, that we ruminate over it, okay? Or the idea that these are peaceful animals. And therefore, if we only eat the flesh of peaceful, pacifistic kind of animals, we ourselves will become nonviolent and pacifistic. Another concept is the concept of the blood prohibition. So in other words, we don't eat animals that consume blood because of this original blood prohibition to humankind. So if we go back to like Genesis 1, we know that humankind was supposed to be vegetarian. Humans and animals were not allowed to eat meat. According to Genesis 1, we were supposed to eat beans and grasses and fruit, et cetera, et cetera. Then we get to Genesis 9, and we have the issue of after the flood, humans were allowed to eat meat, but they were not allowed to consume the blood. So the blood prohibition is for all of humanity starting in Genesis 9. And at that point, God says to Noah, you can eat the meat, just don't consume the blood. In other words, the idea would be pour it out. So we have this original blood prohibition. And then when we get to the laws meant specifically for Israel, the idea would be that Israelites are not allowed, not only can't they consume blood, they can't even consume animals that consume blood. So that's Baruch Levine. And where do we see that as well? Not only regarding the land animals, but regarding birds. So the non-kosher birds are the vulture and the eagle and the crow, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all birds of prey. The non-kosher aquatic creatures are those that have claws. Maybe those are reminiscent of violence, bloodshed, claws. So perhaps the idea then is that dietary laws and the prohibition of eating non-ruminants is based on this original prohibition of blood that we find early on in the chapters of Genesis.
Okay, so now I have a few questions that relate to this, but maybe it's like you could call it sort of a sociological explanation of some of these things. So just on the subject of the animals, I'm thinking we were talking about how we picture things before, and I was thinking about, I picture the Judeans as kind of like mountain people, like Appalachia, the kind of people that don't really like city folks. And I was wondering whether it may be that, like a lot of Jewish practices that we have today, where the practice emerged for some totally different reason, and then down the road somebody tied it to some text or some ethical principle, but really that wasn't the origin at all. Is it possible that part of this really just has to do with the people coming down from the mountains in Judea, coming to the big city and saying, like, we don't eat that food, and, kind of developing a sense of distinction just because we don't like the people that eat that food, as opposed to that we actually have a problem with the food.
I'm not sure about an urban versus mountain distinction per se, because when we imagine cities today, that wasn't the size of cities then. In other words, we have to imagine that cities in ancient Israel perhaps housed a few thousand people maximum. And I don't know whether you had a large urban versus rural. You know when you see that in the Bible, you see that regarding the Tower of Babel story. In Mesopotamia, they had these gigantic cities, okay? And this sort of hatred regarding city life and living in gigantic cities. I think that's evident in the Tower of Babel story. People come together and lest they be scattered out of their insecurity. You also see that in the commandment to Noah and his sons to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And that's understood as in a sense, an anti-urban kind of sentiment. Fill the earth and don't go live in cities. And then you have Genesis 11, where they all come together. So the issue is, what's the sin of the Tower of Babel? And to me, according to the simple sense of the text, is that they came to live in a city, which is in defiance of God's will, that they fill the earth. That's true at the beginning of Genesis. I don't know that when we go later on in the Bible, we have any kind of strong anti-urban feeling, because I don't think Judeans lived in big cities like they did in ancient Mesopotamia.
Okay, well, I'm stuck on a question that still is, I'm on with the goats because of the following. Like, I'm thinking about the evolution of the prohibition against eating milk and meat almost within the Bible itself, even though we don't quite see it. Because I'm just thinking about the scene that I'm a pastoral person, I have various flocks, and I love to eat the goats because the male goats don't do anything valuable, so I'm mostly eating goats. And so here we have this practice that we don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. Well, that seems very moral to me because, we know the mother and we know the baby, and the idea that you're going to boil this particular baby in its own mother's milk seems like an ethical idea that we shouldn't do. But I can imagine in that same family, if they had a non-castrated bull that they wanted to slaughter, they would say, oh, of course we can make this in the milk because it's not his mother. That's the goat's mother, right?
Right.
That goat has nothing to do with that bull. In the same way that my wife and I often will joke if we're having ice cream after a chicken dinner, we'll joke and say, what do you think are the odds that ice cream came from the chicken's mother? And it's like, because we know that in Rabbinic Judaism, the idea of separating chicken and milk is one of these kind of fence around the law, this idea of kind of extending the prohibition just in case. And I'm just sort of wondering whether, do you think it's most likely that was probably also how they saw it in terms of milk and meat back then, that the only prohibition was to not boil a goat in its mother's milk, but any other kind of meat and milk, which, by the way, was only going to be goat's milk or sheep's milk because they didn't have cows for milk at that time. So that the only milk they would have had would have been from goats and sheep. And so the idea that they couldn't boil a bull in milk would have been nonsensical to them, probably.
Right. So the question is, in a sense, how does this very, very, in a sense, restricted prohibition become this huge prohibition?
Well, like how we can kind of imagine, but just to start that it probably was this very restricted prohibition just based on the lifestyle that they had.
So it starts with you can't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. And on a small farm, that would probably happen commonly, that you might end up boiling a baby goat in its own mother's milk. So then the issue is, does it apply to a lamb in its mother's milk? Does it apply to a cow in goat's milk? Does it apply? And I guess, as you said, the whole idea of a fence around the Torah creates this idea where even though it begins very small, it grows very large over time. The issue of chicken, so a chicken is not a mammal.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, in other words,
doesn't have any milk.
But we do eat chicken breast.
Uh-huh. But it's interesting because like as I was thinking about this, I was thinking like, what's the distinction between Jewish food and kosher food? And that, like in my mind, it's this question: is a Reuben sandwich a Jewish food or not? And I think it quite clearly is. That many of us.
It's rye bread, it's corned beef, it's
right, but it has cheese on it, and therefore a lot of people would say, well, it's not kosher. How could it be a Jewish food? But it's served in kosher-style Jewish-type delis. The inventor of it was a Jew. But in the Torah, where Abraham is greeting the messengers who are coming to tell him that he's going to have Isaac, he runs out and makes them meat and milk together. And so I'm just sort of imagining that could have been a Reuben sandwich.
So Abraham ate kosher style.
Yes,
what you're trying to imply.
Yes, and that there may be. I mean, I'm in a little bit of a fun way, but also somewhat seriously. Like I think that it's interesting to sort of pull all the way back to one of the first, at least chronological texts of Abraham greeting the guests that way and serving them milk and meat together, and then a very modern text, which is walking into a deli and ordering a Reuben sandwich, and seeing that there's some connective tissue between the two that is not completely random. Like there actually is a path in which Abraham would have happily eaten a Reuben sandwich, and so can you.
Yeah, so I love the different directions we've gone, and I'm grateful to you for being so enthusiastic about. I mean, I hadn't met you before this conversation. I love how much joy you have talking about these like grimy topics like sacrifice and blood. I could hear in your voice a passion and excitement. So I do have just one sort of final question, just to synthesize a little bit, and this is less sort of a purely Jewish food question and more a Bible question, I guess. And I will give the warning that I give to scholars sometimes that I am going to ask a little bit about sort of your own relationship to the text. Some scholars are nervous to talk about like their own personal relationships to any of this, and you can go in whatever direction you'd like. My question is, I hear that enthusiasm, I hear that joy, I hear a passion, and I think for some people who are taught about Judaism in more traditional spaces, I feel like they'd look at somebody who's a scholar, who takes a historical approach, who doesn't necessarily treat everything as like divine truth. They might be surprised that like, wait, you like love this? Like you're saying it's not historically true, it's not from God, or at least that's not like what's driving your analysis. How do you sort of bring that together with this joy, with this excitement about these texts? And so I'd love to just hear from you, given that you spend your life like unpacking the different ways in which ancient Israelites related to food and related to each other and related to God. Like, how does that relate to your own sense of what Judaism is in your life? And how might, for our listeners, how might they be able to think about a scholarly approach to the Bible as not necessarily like countering a deep relationship to sacred forms of Judaism in other ways?
I would say that what's particularly meaningful and important to me, is this whole comparative approach. Some people might say, well, you read the biblical flood story, you read the flood story from the ancient Near East, they're the same. What's the big deal? So obviously the biblical author plagiarized from an ancient Near Eastern text. But I would say that the similarities are there, but it's the differences that I find very meaningful. Even the idea that humankind is made in God's image. So when we turn to Genesis 1, verse 26, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. So we have this idea of humankind being created in God's image, and therefore humankind, what's the lesson from that? That humankind has infinite value. And anyone who kills a human being pays the ultimate price. And of course, we have capital punishment for homicide in the Bible. So that's a repeated idea. And we might react negatively to that today, but it is based on a very important principle that humankind is created in God's image, and humankind has an infinite value. Okay, now, you take ancient Near Eastern law codes, and you have this idea, you kill someone and you can compensate them with money. And in other words, that human life does not have an infinite value. We take each individual and we decide their value on the basis of perhaps their wealth, their profession, their status in life. So the Bible emphasizes all humankind is created in God's image and not just kings. So there are texts from the ancient Near East that say that the kings are created in God's image. only the kings. In any event, so what I find interesting in the Bible more is the unique ethical perspective it brings to ancient Near Eastern civilization and Jewish life. And one teacher I had who emphasized this a lot was Moshe Greenberg. So in any event, his commentaries and writings are very instructive regarding these ideas.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. You guys are fun.
Well, thank you. We think that we're fun too. And we also think that our guests are fun, including Elaine, Goodfriend today. And we think all of you out there, our listeners, are super, super fun. On that note, we want to close this episode and we want to remind you that there are many, many amazing episodes about Jewish food coming up. They'll make you hungry, they'll make you thirsty, they'll make you intrigued, and hopefully you'll learn something. But if you like eating Jewish food, if you like cooking Jewish food, if you like talking about Jewish food, all of those things are really relevant to what is about to be coming your way in the next few weeks of Judaism Unbound. We hope that you continue journeying through this unit with us and asking big questions about what is Jewish food, and does it matter what is or isn't Jewish food, and what has Jewish food been in different eras and places. All of that is coming your way. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Twitter or Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And third, you can always email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We've been getting a lot of awesome emails lately related to the Anya Shiva and also just related to our podcast episodes. Keep them coming. We love hearing from our listeners. So one more request we have that isn't just about being in touch with us, but is about supporting us, is that we are deeply grateful for any financial support that you are able to send our way. And you can do that at www.judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.